So your boss asks you to start a new project at work. Now what? Starting a new project can be both exciting and overwhelming. And because of that, it's essential that you have a well thought out plan to achieve your goals and meet the expectations of your team and stakeholders. You're listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for all things public health and global health, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the social determinants of health, as well as interesting dialogues about the diverse career opportunities that exist in these fields. Remember to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify so other people like you can benefit from our content.
Before we move on, it is important to note that the views expressed in this podcast are our own and do not necessarily represent any of the agencies or organizations we work for or are affiliated with.
Hi everyone, my name is Gordon, your host for this episode, along with the one and only Bindra. How are you doing, Bindra?
Hello. I'm doing really well.
What are we talking about today?
So today we're talking about the topic of project management and how essentially you can start your own project at work. What are the steps that we need to take before, during, and after starting a new project? And what we'll really do in this episode is try to give you practical tips for pre-project planning, understanding the requirements for projects, communication, collaboration, execution, and monitoring. So a lot of different steps that we'll try to tackle over here.
All right, so listen up, grab a notebook and pen, and let's dive into it. Now, just to give everyone a bigger picture view of what the cycle looks like. So I'm referring to what the project management professionals, and welcome to the project management professional team, Bindra, having become certified, is the whole project life cycle. And that's how I tend to think about projects, and I'm sure that's what you do as well. Mm-hmm. There's starting the project, so initiation, the conception of what the project is. There's a lot of steps in between. And then one component that I feel that people miss out on often is the wrap up, the closing off of the project. There's nothing more that I dislike than projects that run in perpetuity. The whole point of a project is it has a start and end date. Mm-hmm. So that part is important too. So before we go all the way to wrapping up the project, delivering on your deliverables, meeting expectations, satisfying your stakeholders, we have to start. So your boss comes, Bindra, I need you to start a project. I have $500,000 and I need to do this. What are some of the questions that you're asking? What are the first set of things that you're doing to build out this project plan?
Yeah, so I think the first thing you want to figure out when, someone comes to you with starting a project is really know what you need, what the business requirements are before starting the project. Why is the project being started? What is the purpose of it? Really get to know the context and the background before you dive into what will the steps be taken to actually carry out the project. And really to do this, what you can do is read project documentation. So this can refer to old projects that have been done within the organization, things that have been related to the current project that your manager is possibly proposing. You should also consult with stakeholders, really to ensure that you have all the necessary information. So maybe make a list of all the people who you think are relevant to the specific project, people who you think will be impacted first internally and then possibly externally, and then reach out to those people and really gather requirements from them. That's the number one key step to beginning a project. You want to know what you need to ensure that this project will be carried out successfully, and there's no way to better do that before talking to the stakeholders. So make sure that you're able to communicate with the stakeholders, figure out their needs, their requirements. And then the other thing to really keep in mind is determine realistic expectations and goals for the project. You want to set achievable goals that really align with the project's purpose and mission and ensure everyone on the team really agrees with them. So make sure you have conversations with your manager in terms of what is the overall goal for this project, where is this project going to be headed in the long term, and use that information, thinking about that long-term vision to eventually make your short-term goals for the project. So those are the key things you need to keep in mind when you initially start your project. Make sure you're talking to your stakeholders, figuring out the goals for the project, and then using those big picture ideas to eventually move on to the next steps of project planning.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important as well to get all this in writing. So
Exactly.
in writing, what we're referring to here is some of the key documents early in project planning include a project charter. So a project charter would speak to exactly what Bindra mentioned about goals, expectations. How do we know if the project has been successful? Because I'm sure everyone's experienced this at some point where the goalpost moves and then you're no longer sure if what you delivered on is what meets the expectation of what was originally agreed upon. So having that in stone and knowing who the key decision makers are as well. And in the context of project management, that would be whoever the project sponsor is. Because a lot of times, Bindra, sometimes what happens is a project's already conceived and then you're brought on to lead the project. There's times where the project doesn't really exist and you are commissioned to start the project. Especially in the latter case, you have to ensure that you're aligned with what the expectations are and documenting them on paper, getting agreement from all those who are involved in the process in terms of decision making, and then understanding what resources are available. So one of the questions Bindra might ask her boss about that $500,000 project is, can I use this to hire people? What kinds of physical resources do we need? Other departments that might need to be involved, whether it's IT or other different groups. And knowing your resources will help you to effectively plan out your project. Not all projects that you get will be worth $500,000. So scale your degree of planning depending on the level of risk of your project and the dollar amount that goes in, the investment into the project. If it's something quite simple that might take you a couple weeks, maybe you don't have to have such an extensive process. But if it's something where it's high risk, whether financial or reputation wise, or it involves a lot of stakeholders, then you have to do your due diligence.
For sure. Yeah. And I know you mentioned documentation. I think that's definitely very key because scope creep is honestly a real thing. And
what's scope creep?
It's so first, maybe before we get into scope creep, maybe we can talk about scope itself. So scope is essentially what your project is going to be about and what essentially it will be focusing on the actual objective of the project itself in terms of what you're hoping to achieve. And scope creep is when this objective kind of spans out. People are adding additional requirements that come in later on, and what you initially hope for the project to achieve, it becomes something completely different down the line. So I've definitely experienced that. I think when a project goes into the implementation phase and it's actually being executed, some new stakeholders may come on and be like, hey, can we add this on? Can we actually do this instead of what the initial scope of the project was? And I think that's why that documentation is so important right in the beginning. You want to ensure that with the resources that you have and with what is expected of you from leadership and things like that, you have a very defined scope in the beginning. And then that way you're able to really guide the planning to ensure that you're meeting that scope and avoiding scope creep down the road, which may lead to further issues.
That is a perfect segue to talking a little bit more about understanding project requirements. You did touch on it a little bit, Bindra, about engaging stakeholders and finding out what their expectations are, what they hope to get out of the project. And a key part of requirements is the whole benefits realization component of it. So you do this project, who are the different groups that will benefit from this project delivering on its goals? And the key part of this here is to systematically go about this process. In project management, collecting the requirements is an important step. And essentially what you want to do is once you identify the objectives of the project and what your success criteria is, all the requirements that you collect should align with that. So one tool that I like to use in my practice is called the requirements traceability matrix. And what it essentially does is to map, people might have suggestions. Oh, I think it should do this. I think it should do that. And then your question would be, walk me through how this aligns with what we were hoping to get out of the project. And those types of discussions can help the group realize maybe what things are outside of the scope of this particular project. That's a fun exercise that I like to do. Some people don't like it. You have to navigate those conversations tactfully. And collecting the requirements also allows you to rank them down the road, because there might be a change in direction, funding might be pulled and then you have to wrap up the project sooner than you would have liked. And knowing what things are priority in terms of requirements ahead of time can allow you to make shrewd decisions and in what to include in the final product or service that you're delivering as a result of this project.
I think in addition to also gathering requirements, another important step when you initially begin the project and are planning it out is really determining potential risks that may occur with the project and how you can possibly mitigate those risks as well. This can include anything from like delays in the project timelines, budget constraints, things like that. I think those are really important to figure out right in the beginning, and then possibly how you might actually navigate those risks when they become issues and how you can potentially solve them when they do occur. So I think that's something you really need to think about in the beginning, along with the project requirements too.
So you get the requirements, and before we start having conversation around the schedule, we have to know what the work looks like. So we have an idea of what the project looks like, the requirements, and we're developing the project management plan. And what we get is a set of potentially milestones or deliverables that are articulated early on. How do we go about planning what's next in terms of executing the work?
So what you want to do when you have larger milestones is really break those down into smaller, manageable tasks. And in project management, that's called creating a work breakdown structure. So when you do break down larger objectives into smaller tasks, it creates work packages, and then you're able to actually designate those work packages to possibly maybe different individuals on your team who'll be working on those projects, or just different timelines as well. You can use those work packages to actually create your overall schedule for the project as well. So I think in project management, when you're figuring out what to do for a project, the best thing is to break it down into the smallest pieces, and that way you can work your way towards figuring out the next steps each step of the way.
And I like that you brought up work packages, because some projects are complex. If you focus on just organizational projects, you might have ones that involve different departments, and they're not necessarily the lead on the project. So it's important that they have an idea, or a clear understanding rather, of what they're expected to do as part of the project team. Those work packages are essentially component of work that has maybe many tasks and subtasks in it that can be assigned to a department or one person for execution. So that allows you to shift work around appropriately. And then the next thing, and you mentioned that breaking down into smaller tasks too, by doing that, you can then start to think about how long does it take to do each specific task and what order you need to do the specific task in. And then those are the two questions that you need to answer when you're going to build out your project schedule. And that can look like a Gantt chart, can look like a basic schedules, whatever floats your boat. And that's the next critical step. These are very technical components that we're talking about. I find that even reflecting myself, one thing that is always or tends to get neglected more often than it should is the communication pieces of it and the collaboration pieces of it. So what are some practical tips do you have in this regard when we get into the thick of the project? We've already established goals, we're working with the right people, and then I just put my head down at the work desk. I'm very stressed out. I work a whole day, and my team doesn't hear from me, stakeholders doesn't hear from me. Walk us through the importance on communication and maybe how we can do that.
So I believe communication is honestly the number one most important thing when it comes to project management. You want to make sure that you have clear and established lines of communication with everyone involved in the project. So all of the stakeholders that are present. And really this involves a lot of thinking and figuring out how exactly certain stakeholders want to be communicated to, because not everyone would want communication the same way. And I've experienced this personally where there's certain stakeholders who want meetings and they want to use those meetings as a form of their communication. They don't want any emails whatsoever. There's other stakeholders who don't want to attend any meetings whatsoever, only want to be communicated via emails. So you really have to establish those lines of communications in the very beginning. Figure out what your first of all, figure out who your stakeholders are, as we mentioned early on. Then what those stakeholder needs are and how they want to be communicated and how frequently and how often they want to be communicated. I think that's very important too. I've experienced situations where there are stakeholders that don't receive any communication until the very end of the project when it's coming to a close, and they get super pissed and they're like, what is happening? Why was I not informed of any of this? So that's what happens when you have not established those clear lines of communication from the very beginning. You really have to sit down with your stakeholders and start those conversations very early on. So that's definitely one of the key things, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I would say, so you touched on the importance of communication, assessing the different communication channels, preferences. But I also think how you communicate is important, and what you're communicating about. What I mean by that is what you're communicating about could be a project update. So yeah, maybe it's weekly, maybe it was agreed upon that the group would like at least communication once a week, and you're just simply sharing an update. You might be communicating specifically about action items or decisions that need to be made. Does that need to be done a little bit differently depending on how people respond to emails? Is it a meeting? Is it a phone call? Who needs to be at that meeting? And are you required as part of this project, whether it's an internal agreement or by the funding body, to produce regular reports? So communicating, sharing a report is going to look different from informal communication through email. So understanding the different types of things that you'd be communicating about and having a strategy for that as well. That's very important.
For sure, yeah. I think even the way that you have meetings, you want to ensure that certain meetings, for example, with leadership are very short, very concise, and you're maybe giving them a brief, like 1 to 2 slide deck, versus other stakeholders who may want that longer report, want to get into the nitty-gritty details, and may want longer meetings and more working sessions versus just here are the quick updates. So for sure, I think you need to figure out how you want to communicate, and that will vary greatly from each stakeholder to the next.
Yeah. And yeah, a little pet peeve of mine is when an email is longer than it needs to be.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you just take a step and think about it for a sec, a lot of times people send long emails. Sometimes they're being very thorough, and that's right. I appreciate that. But just be mindful of, even if you had an action item buried, I had to scroll 2 times to see what the action item is. You're getting in your own way. So make your emails only as long as they need to be. If people need additional details, you could say, hey, I've attached a document with additional context if you need to explore that, but keep the action item in the email body, and I wouldn't really include too much else other than the key important things that people need to know and that people can act on.
Yeah, I think email writing is honestly an art.
It's an art, that's right.
You need to figure out how you need to write certain emails to certain individuals and really think about how they want the information and how they would possibly respond, right? I know sometimes I spent like an hour writing an email because I know it's going to go to this one person. They're probably going to reply back with like one-liners, and maybe you want to change the way that you're sending these emails, right? So definitely an art.
Right. Now, the other components here, so we touched on communication, the collaboration pieces of it. In a project team, people have different degrees of strengths, weaknesses, and understanding. So after you understand what resources that you have available to the project, how big your project team is going to be, and who specifically will be on your project team, there's going to be a shared work component of this too. And you want to assign, like Bindra mentioned, the work packages to someone who has the competency to do that. So if you're new to an organization, Bindra, or you're collaborating with members of the team who you maybe are unfamiliar with, what's the best way to go about this collaboration piece?
Yeah, I think it's really important to figure out the roles and responsibilities in the very beginning, because you want to avoid any confusion later on, because sometimes you may assign the same work package to 2 different individuals, and maybe they assume that they're supposed to figure out who's responsible for which part of it. And I think that really involves laying out those expectations in the very beginning. And I would suggest maybe having a kickoff meeting possibly with all of your team members, and going over all the work packages involved and who's going to be responsible for what. I know in project management, we use this tool called a RACI, which is essentially a chart where you can write down each individual who's involved with the project. You can indicate who's responsible for a certain piece of the project, who is accountable for a piece, who's only going to be informed, things like that. So I think there's many tools in place which will help you figure out what kind of involvement each person will have when they're working on a specific work package, and how you will go about maintaining that involvement throughout the duration of the project as well.
Once we're in the middle of executing the project, we've established roles and responsibilities. That can be done with the support of your manager, whoever the project sponsor is. You might be at a similar role to whoever your project team is, and you might not feel positioned to assign them work. So if you need to work with your manager or someone else to do that, that's a good idea. But establishing clear expectations on what's expected of everybody in the team is very important. And you're getting along, you're doing the work, you're providing reports. And the point of this is not to be passive. So the check-ins, the sharing of information, it's to identify issues proactively. And for issues that are identified when they happen, to share that with the team and collaboratively come up with solutions to whatever issues that might emerge. So this is where the monitoring component comes in for when you're working on a project, you're sharing information, and then you're making changes on the fly to the project. Things can happen. So that's a very incredibly important piece of this too. What are some of the things that you do, Bindra, monitoring schedule, monitoring for scope creep? How do you go about that, and how do you communicate when those issues emerge?
So I think the first thing I do before any project is even started, in the very early phases, I establish like a lessons learned kind of document. So even in the planning stages, when you're facing certain issues or things that come up, you're able to document it right away and really document the issue and how you went about solving that issue too. So in case it were to come up later on during the duration of the project, you can refer back to this lessons learned document. And that's a way of monitoring how the project is going and how you can solve any issues that occur throughout. So that's definitely one thing I use. The other thing I also use is doing a lot of knowledge sharing. So I tend to have, at every single phase of a project, I tend to have meetings with the internal team members, and it's similar to lessons learned, but just kind of a stop and pausing and discussing of where we're at in the project, what things have gone well, what things haven't gone well. And usually this tends to occur at the very end of a project, but I think it's very important to have certain points during the duration of the project and have this throughout the project as well. So you can monitor the things that have been going well and haven't been going well, and how you can make improvements before the project is even done. And that way we can ensure that the project overall in the end is successful. So I think that's two methods that I use just for evaluating the entirety of the project during the planning and executing phase itself. I think it's very important that you do that knowledge sharing, that lessons learned throughout the project and not just at the very end.
So while we're on that topic, we've done that. We've met our objectives for the project. We've produced all these deliverables. And as far as I'm concerned, the project's done. We can move on. Is that the best approach?
Definitely not. So you can't just close a project just like that. There's different steps that you need to take in terms of closing out a project. And the first thing, as I mentioned, is to have that larger lessons learned and really have all of the stakeholders who are part of the project, first of all, know that the project is ending after the deliverables have been accepted and everything is good to go. You want to make sure that you're discussing the end, the closing out of the project with everyone, and who that project will be passed on to in terms of when a project usually ends, it goes to more operations work. So how that project will feed out from implementation to more so operations, which teams will be taking over, hence forth. So I think things like that are things you definitely need to consider before just outright closing out a project, because no one really knows what's going to happen when that project is closed so immediately without taking the proper steps.
Yeah. And I always think it's a good idea too to produce a wrap-up report or project summary report, a presentation for the stakeholders
100%.
too, and then next steps, which would include like what you said. So this is done. So-and-so will inherit this, they'll do this, and as far as our role is concerned, or my role is concerned, I can be consulted with about this and that, and just making it clear when a project's ended. That's a very important step. And then the housekeeping side of it too, looking at the budget, assessing How do we do for the budget? Are there any leftover funds? Are there opportunities to use those? Did you go over budget? What are you going to do about it? So that's where a lot of these conversations would happen, keeping in mind that you would still have been monitoring these throughout the whole project too. But at the end, there'd be a bit of an assessment or post-mortem, I guess that you would call it, in terms of how the project shaped up. So, Bindra, for those who are in this position that we started talking about at the beginning of the episode, your boss asked you to start a new project. Now, what is the biggest thing you've learned from starting projects?
The biggest thing I've learned from starting out projects is you want to make sure that you really spend a lot of time on the planning phase and don't really jump right to implementation or execution. You want to make sure
me to start right now.
No, I think you should explain to your boss why it's so important to plan everything out. And I think usually people tend to understand because you want to make sure that you're not losing out your money right away. Like if you actually plan out properly, then you're going to be able to save more money on this project, maybe not, use up all your entire budget and not make issues occur that don't necessarily need to occur. Really think about those risks in the beginning, things like that. I feel like being proactive is always better than being reactive when it comes to project management. So spending a lot of time on that project planning phase, making sure that the right stakeholder is involved, that you're communicating. I think that's so important because obviously no project's ever going to be perfect, but you want to make sure that you're taking the steps to ensure that you can try to make it go as smoothly as possible.
For me, the biggest thing that I learned was ensuring that you set clear expectations of yourself and others, ensuring that those expectations are understood, reinforcing those expectations constantly throughout the project, and clearly communicating about the status of the project. Because at the end of the day, even on a selfish level, as a project lead, what will make you look good is stakeholders being satisfied with the project.
Exactly.
So it's entirely possible that you had a very ambitious project that failed to accomplish what the initial goals were set out to be. That doesn't necessarily have to be a reflection on how good Bindra was as a project manager or how bad. Stakeholder satisfaction has the incredible power of shifting how we perceive how something went. So if they're satisfied with how they were engaged, how the communication was throughout the process, that is in of itself a success. So don't forget that.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think stakeholders' satisfaction is the number one key thing because even if a project seems failed from your end, they may love it and they may be like, yeah, that was great. We loved it. We loved the way it was executed. It worked out well. And it's actually a success even though you may not think it is. So I think everything is dependent on how they perceive it because at the end of the day, the project is for the stakeholders. You want to make them happy.
Absolutely. This was Gordon and Bindra, your favorite public health professionals, talking about project management. In particular, how do you go about starting a new project when your boss comes to you with this insurmountable task? Signing off. Until next time. Peace.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. See you in the next one.